Good morning, everyone. I'm Dana Goldman. I'm the founding director of what's now called the USC Schaeffer Institute for Public Policy and Government Service. And on behalf of the entire USC community, I want to welcome you to this dialogue and how the FDA can better meet today's innovation challenges. Much of our decades-long work at Schaeffer, which spans more than 1,000 papers, probably half of them written by Darius, has focused on the value of preventing and treating diseases like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. And our research suggests that policy reforms to better balance patient access with incentives to innovate really matter for outcomes. And so it should come as no surprise that the Schaeffer Center is now ranked 4th in the world in health economics, ahead of our neighbors across the street, the World Bank, and alongside such academic powerhouses as Harvard, MIT, and the University of Chicago. But to date, we've done very little on the FDA reform. And today, I'm happy to announce that this changes. You're going to hear from Lowell Schiller, a non-resident senior scholar at Schaeffer and former FDA Acting Chief Counsel. And he, in collaboration with Professor Unjo Pacifici and our Director of Public Policy, Barry, the one who is getting coffee, they published a Schaeffer white paper on how the FDA can modernize drug development by streamlining clinical trials, providing clearer guidance to innovators, and improving agency efficiency. And I'm pleased to report that we have an all-star lineup to complement Lowell. It looks a bit like our hometown Dodgers, except for the bullpen. Sorry, that's an inside joke, but I couldn't resist. It's baseball season. Yeah, it's playoff season. Anyway, you'll hear from former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb and former Acting Commissioner Janet Woodcock. We're very pleased they could join us. They've been very accommodating to the Schaeffer Center in the past. They're going to be joined by Ken Drazan, CEO of ArsenalBio and a board member of the Schaeffer Center, along with Annie Kennedy, Chief of Policy Advocacy and Patient Engagement at the Every Life Foundation. Almost done. So on behalf of the Schaeffer Institute, thank you to our distinguished speakers for joining us today. One housekeeping item, there are going to be opportunities for questions from the audience throughout the program. For those on Zoom, you're invited to submit your questions using the Q&A function, and those will get shared with the moderator. And of course, we'll get to as many questions as we can. And with that, I invite Lowell to the stage.
Well, thank you, Dana. And thanks everyone for coming out today or for tuning in. Lots going on at FDA. There's new leadership, major workforce adjustments, lots of new thinking about lots of topics. And it's all happening at the same time as we're seeing just a golden age in biomedical innovation. We're seeing incredible new treatments and therapies, cell and gene therapies, personalized medicine, sophisticated diagnostics, and increasingly powerful development tools, things that can help products come to market faster, more cost effectively, can answer research questions that might not have been feasible a few years ago. So what we wanted to do was try to meet this moment with recommendations for the new leadership that can help to seize upon this innovation, help FDA keep pace, and ultimately do that in a way that expands patient access. Now, FDA is a scientific agency. It obviously does not regulate price, but the policies it sets and the way it goes about doing things can have a huge impact on the market. So everything from determining which products can lawfully be marketed to setting policies that shape the incentives for which R&D happens, setting the policies around competition from follow-on products, generics, biosimilars, follow-on branded drugs too, regulating the supply chain and how likely it is that we're going to see supply chain disruptions. But then also some of the major inputs that go into the price of drugs. So things like what R&D is needed to bring a product to market and what's the time and the cost of that. what happens on the post-market side and what costs are necessary, and how much regulatory uncertainty is there. And that can be a major cost driver too, which is something I'll get to. Now, keep in mind, product development, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and lots of products don't make it through. So commonly cited statistics, 9 years on average to get from start of clinical development to an FDA submission, can be up to close to $3 billion on average once you take into account all the products that don't make it. And there's a lot of products that don't make it. Over 90% that enter clinical development don't make it through. So if you want to think about how do we speed the pace of innovation, lower the cost, this is where to look. Now, it's great if you can shave a few months off of the FDA review clock, and if you can do that without sacrificing the quality of the review. But if you want to have a real impact, this is where the action is. And that's where we've been looking. So we approached this white paper that you all have at your chairs with the question, how do we help to accelerate innovation, do it more cost effectively, and broaden patient access, minimize disruptions, but do it in a way where we're not sacrificing scientific rigor and we're not lowering the bar for safety or effectiveness. And it's a big topic. We tried to cover a lot of ground, organized our thinking into 6 topic areas. And we have a number of recommendations within each of those topic areas. It doesn't make sense to go through recommendation by recommendation this morning. What I thought we'd do is just highlight each of those 6 and then talk about some thematic points that come out throughout the paper as we go through each of those. So first area is modernizing evidence generation. As I mentioned earlier, we're seeing lots of cutting edge development tools that have enormous promise. Things like innovative trial designs, increasingly sophisticated uses of data from real world clinical practice. And we're seeing a lot of uses of those, but at the same time, because they're new, there's just not that much precedent for what FDA is going to do with applications that rely on those tools. And FDA has done a great job in recent years at de-risking by putting out more guidance, by providing opportunities for developers to interact with the agency on a one-off basis. And our recommendations go to ways that the agency can expand on that guidance, expand on those opportunities, and adjust some policies in a few places. Another area we looked at is rare disease. It's got unique challenges for drug development. The small patient size, the heterogeneity, the way many of these diseases run their course. A lot of the tools that are used conventionally in drug development, certainly the randomized controlled trial, it's not always feasible with these types of products. And so, this is another place where FDA has been pretty forward-looking and has taken the context into account and provided a certain degree of regulatory flexibility. But the flip side to regulatory flexibility is predictability can be a challenge. And the agency's done some work here. We have some recommendations to try to improve that predictability and have some more scalable models. One thing I will note is just in the last week or two, FDA came out with a new program, the Rare Disease Evidence Principles, which does a few different things, but among others, more opportunities for early stage interactions from certain rare disease developers and FDA. And that's a great thing. Many of our recommendations are complementary to that, so more at the level of programmatic guidance rather than individual sponsor interactions. Another area is supply chain oversight and how do we have fewer disruptions, fewer drug shortages, which have all sorts of rippling effects throughout the market. And part of that is looking at trying to onshore manufacturing. FDA has struggled historically with oversight of facilities in certain jurisdictions. So if we can increase that oversight and work on onshoring, that will help a lot. A few ideas that come up here. One is developing a public rating system around supply chain resilience. This is something that FDA and HHS have talked about in the past. We think it's time to start acting on that. And also some work to further incentivize and de-risk advanced manufacturing technologies, which hold enormous promise to have fewer disruptions in this space, but have been challenging in the past. And we think if we could implement those, we'd see hopefully comparative advantage for domestic producers that implement that. Okay, I broke the clicker. Here we go. Another area is accelerated approval. And this is simultaneously one of FDA's biggest success stories and also one of its most controversial programs. It's the pathway where for serious and life-threatening conditions, drugs can be approved oftentimes years earlier than they otherwise would, based upon a measurement that's predictive of clinical benefit, but isn't itself an establishment of benefit. And then on the flip side, post-market, you have confirmatory studies to determine whether that benefit is real. It's been hugely successful in the sense that over 300 products have come to market through this pathway. About half of them have gone on to full conventional approvals. And that's years of earlier patient access for serious life-threatening conditions. But it's also been controversial, the subject of recent legislative reform, in large part because of spotty follow-through on the post-market side and a handful of very controversial decisions where there were questions around process in particular. As an outgrowth of some of that controversy, we're also starting to see more payers question whether there should be coverage for certain products that come through this pathway. And that ultimately is defeative of the purpose of accelerated approval, which is broadening patient access. And so what we looked at is what are some ways to strengthen the program to deal with some of these issues that can continue providing that earlier access. So some of that is how do you improve follow-up or follow-through on confirmatory studies. And we think part of that should be incorporating more clinical practice data into the study design. And then some procedural reforms around how the pathway operates, primarily to provide a level of transparency so that when you look at it, no change to the substantive standards, no limitations on substantive flexibility. But if you can better understand how the agency came to its decision, how scientific dissent was addressed, on the back end, there can be more trust in the decisions that were made. And part of that, too, is probably some reforms to the advisory committee process, which does have real benefits, especially in the accelerated approval context. We looked at AI, and this is a hot topic, both in terms of FDA's oversight of AI and regulated products, but also the agency's own use of AI in its operations, including in product reviews. That's something I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. And also advancing drug competition and how to build on the successes of the Drug Competition Action Plan, the Biosimilars Action Plan that were launched in the first Trump administration and carried forward during the Biden administration. So that's kind of the whirlwind tour of what's in the paper. Lots of detail in the document itself. We'd like you to read it if you haven't already. But what I wanted to do now is drill down on one topic in particular that comes out throughout the paper, which is the importance of reducing regulatory uncertainty. And this is an area where I think of it as kind of a hidden tax on innovation and a regressive one at that. And what I mean is, if you think about how risky product development is, drug development in particular, the long timelines, the failure rate, the cost, if you get to the end of that process to your submission to FDA, and it turns out there were fundamental problems that could have been addressed years earlier, part of the trial design, you don't want to find out about that after you submit. You want to know early on so that you haven't wasted time and cost. You don't have that really costly late-stage failure. So reducing uncertainty reduces that risk. When you have more uncertainty, it ultimately drives up the cost of capital. Investors, when the investment looks riskier, and regulatory risk is part of that, you're going to need to see greater return on investment, which means the cost of the capital that's going to fund R&D goes up. The more you can reduce uncertainty, the more you can de-risk and ultimately reduce those costs. And I mentioned it's a regressive tax. The smaller players don't have the same resources as the larger ones in terms of teams of FDA lawyers, regulatory affairs staff. The uncertainty hits harder when you aren't as well resourced. And so it especially hits in some of the areas like rare disease development, where you see more smaller companies playing. So what we did in our paper is we looked at, and you see throughout, lots of areas where FDA can do things to reduce that uncertainty. One thing that comes up over and over is the importance of guidance documents. And there are a number of recommendations for different types of guidance where it would be helpful for FDA to revise, to expand, to put out some new guidance, or maybe change policies. These are documents where it's not legally binding, but it lays out the agency's thinking on a particular topic, hugely beneficial to industry and staff because it becomes that touchstone for what is the agency's policy on a particular topic. I do want to say a word about guidance relative to other things like the early stage interactions one-off with a sponsor and the reviewers. They're all helpful, but they're complementary. They're not substitutes. So you don't get around putting out good guidance by having more early stage interactions because you need the guidance to ground those interactions to provide the policy touchstone. And a lot of where guidance has benefits is upstream of that. When you're thinking about where to invest, what development pipelines to pursue, the guidance tells you a lot about what the risks are. So we recommend in a number of places. And we recognize that guidance development can be resource intensive. You need to have policy staff to do that. And in the workforce adjustments at FDA, policy staff were hit fairly hard. So we're not blind to that. But we thought it was still important to recommend where we saw high value applications for agency guidance. And hopefully that can help with some of the resourcing and prioritization. Another way to reduce uncertainty is revisiting outdated requirements. Anytime you put out a regulation or other requirement, as time goes on, new circumstances arise. It's not always clear how the old rules apply to the new circumstances. Sometimes you can get around that with guidance. Other times you really need to go back and revisit the rules. One example that I think is just a great one here is around advanced manufacturing technologies. These are things like AI in manufacturing, continuous manufacturing, distributed models. They hold enormous promise, but FDA struggled over years to try to get more manufacturers to adopt these. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but GAO took a look, and one of the big issues is regulatory uncertainty. FDA's manufacturing regulations, they were largely drafted for conventional methods. And when you try to apply them to these cutting edge techniques, it's not always clear how they map. If there was to be an effort, and it would probably be industry and FDA working together to identify where are the challenges, but an effort to go through and update the manufacturing regulations to make it clear how it applies to AMTs, that could do a lot to de-risk the technology, and we could see more investment there. The last thing I wanted to touch on is AI and product reviews. And there's been a lot of talk about that recently. FDA launched a new tool called ELSA, which I actually think is a great first step at integrating AI into the review process. It'll require some updates and refinement, but lots to say about it. What excites me in particular is the opportunities for reducing uncertainty and for making product reviews more predictable, more consistent, which is an issue that FDA has taken criticism on for years. Think about ways that you could apply a sophisticated AI or other advanced tool in the context of a drug review. So you have a mountain of data and you're trying to spot the falsified data. AI can probably do that faster and better than a human reviewer. Or if you automate a statistical analysis, these are ways you can free up reviewer time, probably do things better too. And with that freed up time, the reviewers can focus more on making sure that what they're doing is consistent with guidance, consistent with past precedent. And that could have tremendous benefits for the predictability of product reviews. Now, guardrails and governance would be important here. You want to make sure there are human decision makers. It's not driven by the algorithm. And that means this probably isn't the right way of thinking about this probably is not, you can do drug reviews with a small team of junior reviewers. You still need to have your seasoned reviewers there to make sure the AI output makes sense. But if you have that and other guardrails, things like training data, auditability, governance, auditability, transparency, this could be enormous potential for improving the predictability of reviews. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Barry. Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
For those of you who took the opportunity to come in from the cold weather outside to join us in person, you get the first opportunity to ask questions. And while you're thinking about your question, I do want to point out one of the coolest emoticons in that PowerPoint presentation was the little dinosaur. Was that cool? Scott and I are just looking at this. That's awesome. I'm going to kind of use that more and more. No. All right. So that was, as Lowell mentioned, a quick review of a very long paper, 218 some odd citations, which we labor of love for the three of us that wrote it. But would love to take any questions first from those of you in the room, and then we have some folks online. For those of you online, please submit your questions via the Q&A thing, and I've got a direct line to that here on my iPhone. So, anyone? Please, Bill. Actually.
Good morning. And well, Dana, thank you. I've known Dana for a while for a wonderful program. I'm a fellow Trojan as well, but thank you for a great presentation. With this being World Alzheimer's Month, I've dedicated my life losing my mother and uncle that were World War II veterans. Rosa Parks, whose organization I just came from in Detroit. Mrs. Parks had Alzheimer's. A lot of people aren't aware of that. And I work with a startup biotech company out of La Jolla that has very promising treatments with proof of concepts. We're ready to go into phase 1 trials, but getting the money is a challenge. So again, this global tsunami is going to break healthcare systems. I just don't see where there's really a true commitment globally we're pulling together. I mean, like with COVID, Scott, you saw it yourself, Dr. Gottlieb. I mean, all the best minds work together. What does it take for the U.S. to take the lead? Because really, I don't see anyone else taking that lead, but we got to come together. This disease doesn't discriminate, but it's an opportunity to work together to deal with the most pressing healthcare challenge that I see on the horizon. Thank you.
Yeah, completely agreed. One thing I will flag, this is something that at Schaeffer, we've been thinking a lot about. There's been a lot of effort, particularly on recruitment for Alzheimer's trials, which has been a challenge in many ways. And I'll just do a plug for the Schaeffer's clinical trial recruitment lab, which has been doing great work on exactly that point.
All right, great. I actually goofed on the timeline. We don't have any more time for questions. We got to move on, but there will be opportunity for questions when we get to the panel discussion and after Dr. Gottlieb speaks. So now we're going to switch over to my quick introduction of Dr. Gottlieb. Those of you who don't already know, he was former commissioner of FDA from 2017 and 2019, but he actually came to the FDA with a lot of experience before that because he had worked as deputy commissioner for medical and scientific affairs from 2005 and 2007, was heavily involved in some of the work the FDA has done in generics in other areas. While he was commissioner, he was transformative in advancing cell and gene therapies. He had approved the first gene therapy product in U.S. history and launched major initiatives to accelerate this field, adding 50 additional reviewers and issuing new guidance documents. His prediction that FDA would approve 10 to 20 cell and gene therapy products annually by 2025 has proven remarkably accurate. He's also made significant strides in generic drug competition, successfully bringing to the market the first generic competitor to EpiPen in 2018 and a generic Advair competitor in 2019. And under his leadership, 14% of FDA's 1,000 plus generic approvals in 2018 were for complex generic drugs. As Politico observed on his departure, Gottlieb has been active and aggressive on many issues as commissioner without hewing to a strictly conservative or liberal ideology. It's an approach that's won him praise from many in the health sector. Please welcome Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here today. It's great to be here on the day of Lowell unveiling this report to all of you. Thanks for the introduction, and listening to those achievements makes me think of how important all the people at FDA were to doing those things. Janet Woodcock's here today. The things that we did over that period couldn't have gotten done without her strong leadership in the center and the partnership that we had, and my ability to work with the professional staff of FDA in a very constructive way, and Lowell as well. And Lowell at FDA was one of our most effective policymakers. Whenever we had hard problems that we needed to solve, policy problems, we would we would give them to Lowell and he would think of solutions. I remember when we were putting out the biosimilar framework, there were some difficult issues. You probably remember with the NDC codes and trying to rationalize certain aspects of the statute against what we needed to do in regulation. Lowell figured it out. He came up with an ingenious solution we were able to incorporate into guidance. He also helped us divide a pathway. This is probably something you don't want me to talk about. He helped us create a pathway for the legal sale of CBD in this country. Who would have thought? It was a perfect solution where we would have sold CBD as a dietary supplement in a low dose formulation where we had few concerns about any potential risks. And then we would have preserved the higher dose for prescription only where there was an approved product. And ultimately it didn't get out. I thought it was the right solution. It got hung up at the White House, I think, at the time. Maybe they'll revisit it. But that was the kind of thinking that Lowell brought to the job, trying to work within the confines of the statute and regulation, always cognizant of what Congress did and didn't want us to do, to try to apply our authorities in ways to solve difficult public health challenges as they emerged. And most of all, when you work in these institutions, I think you want to think about how do you leave the institution when you're a political appointee? How do you leave the institution stronger than what it was when you got there? And how do you respect the mission of the institution in terms of the execution of your job? And that was a core part of Lowell's ethos. He was committed to them. And that's why he was really well liked within FDA and beloved by, I think, the career staff and many others. So it should be no surprise that he came up with such a thoughtful report. I want to reflect on a few thoughts of my own and then come back to some of the recommendations in the report. We really, as you heard at the outset and as Lowell laid out, we really stand at an unprecedented time for innovation in this country. If you see what's happening with cell therapies, I'm just finished a book on the history of the development of CAR T therapy. It's available on Amazon. You can pre-order it right now. It'll be out next year. You think about what's happening with RNAi and a lot of other different new platforms. When I was at FDA in the early 2000s as deputy commissioner, I remember we were just about to approve Dendrion's product Provenge. It would have been sort of the first modern cell therapy, not like a CAR T therapy. It worked differently, but there was a real palpable excitement within CBER at the time about a whole wave of products that we thought were right around the corner. And that was probably 2007 or 2006. When I came back a decade later in 2017, literally 2 months after I arrived at FDA, we had approved the first CAR T product, Kymriah. And so that was a decade. It took a decade to see that innovation come to fruition. But now you're seeing the pace of that progress really accelerate with what's in the pipeline. There are 115 global clinical trials involving pluripotent stem cells. There's 3,700 different clinical trials involving cell and gene therapy and RNAi therapeutics. So a real explosion in all of these new modalities. And I think it demonstrates what happens when you have a new approach to solving disease. At first, it's tentative as you figure out how to apply new technologies, how to manufacture them. If you think back to the early days of antibodies in the late 1990s and early 2000s, if someone would have said to me back then that we'll one day be using a monoclonal antibody to treat high cholesterol, I would have looked at you like you were crazy. I mean, it would have made no sense to me. These drugs were being used for second and third line cancer indications. I remember we used to say the process is the product. We couldn't fully characterize them. Manufacturing was expensive, cost of goods was still high. And now you look at where we are with monoclonal antibodies. And I think that we are in the early innings of cell and gene therapy. And in the future, we're going to be using a lot of these modalities for much more routine conditions and sort of fulfilling the original vision of cell therapy, that it would have regenerative potential in different diseases. Near term, there are some threats to innovation and there's some threats to this ecosystem. I think near term, a lot of it is what's been happening at the agency in terms of the impacts just on the workforce. And I think that that's going to put a tremendous strain on the agency at a time when all these opportunities are really palpable. And, while it will have some impact on product review, the bigger impact is going to be on the ability of the agency to lean forward with the kinds of policy reforms you see here and find the time to do that work and engage the community. If they've lost sort of 1/3 of the review staff and people have to focus more and more just on the day job of reviewing applications and can't engage as thought leaders in the scientific community and the product development community, write journal articles, come to meetings, interact, work on policy development. I think long term, if I was to focus on what I think the biggest challenge is. It's really this secular threat from the ecosystem growing up in China. For many years, U.S. drug makers outsourced a lot of the early pharmacology work to China, where local firms would synthesize drugs according to specifications that were given to them by U.S. manufacturers. And then the resulting compounds would be tested in U.S.-based clinical trials. And it was sort of illustrated a seamless division of global labor, if you will. But at the time, the Chinese labs really really excelled at medicinal chemistry. And so they were able to synthesize compounds cheaper, more quickly, on behalf of U.S. manufacturers, and gradually they started to get into more advanced compounds, monoclonal antibodies, bispecifics, but they were mostly working as contract manufacturers. However, along the way, they mastered the art of designing novel drugs, and gradually, just instead of executing Western blueprints, they've started to get into drug development itself. And the result is that you have an ecosystem in China right now with more than twice as many CAR T trials are currently underway in China than in the US. And if you look at sort of intense areas of scientific activity, CAR T development for gastrointestinal cancers, of the 17 global trials evaluating cell therapies for cancers of the pancreas, gut, or liver, 13 are being conducted in China right now. And now you can argue that there's a higher prevalence of certain cancers in China that are amenable to these therapies. But the reality is that you're seeing a lot of the global innovation shift to China. And as a drug development migrates to China, American investments migrating there too. 5 years ago, U.S. drug makers sourced none of their products from China. Last year, it was fully 1/3. And that number is going up, and you're seeing more bigger deals and later stage deals. And, owing to the aptitude of the Chinese-based discovery, what's happening now is many U.S. firms are waiting to the last possible moment to file their patents, lest they give away their Western blueprints and it gets quickly copied by Chinese drug developers, which is what's happening. When I work in venture capital right now, when we see a new proposal that looks promising to us that we may invest in, first thing we do is scour the market in China to see if there's any competing molecule. And more we're finding that there is multiple companies manufacturing similar molecules already in China, and we pull back from the investments. And if that's happening, once a month in my work, you distribute that across the entire industry. You can imagine how much investment's being pulled out of U.S. ecosystems right now, both from people going and acquiring those molecules in China, starting companies around them, or people pulling back from investments in the U.S. because of the concerns about the threat of innovation being done in China. Now, that said, there's a movement afoot in Washington to put restrictions on the IP flows from China, put an excise tax on deals, maybe subject them to some kind of higher scrutiny. Some people talk about CFIUS. I will tell you that there's been venture capitalists lobbying the White House. This has been reported on, trying to get the White House to do some kind of executive order around this. I'm not sure, based on my own channel checks, that this is high on the agenda at the White House and something's imminent. But it shows you the palpable concerns within the biotech ecosystem in the US. China's largely capitalized on two advantages. One is the low cost of labor. The second is their ability to advance new compounds into early stage clinical trials and gain quick feedback and allow them to iterate their molecules more quickly. But there are some reforms we can make to how we design and execute clinical trials that I think make it far more competitive here in the US. Our best lever for countering China, we're not going to be able to match their low cost of labor. Our best lever for countering them is really going to be to think about how to modernize our regulatory framework, where we can streamline particularly early phases of development and give American developers the same edge in testing compounds that the Chinese now enjoy. To these ends, coming back fully to the report, this is where I think a lot of the ideas in the report are exceedingly important and highly relevant. Lowell really looks across the entire sweep of drug development from the beginning to the end. But I think fundamentally, a lot of these proposals, by my eye, deal with creating structural improvements in the policy framework that build a better foundation on which to construct future policies around clinical trials. This report really gets at how do you build a stronger institution from a policy standpoint for drug development. Lowell calls for streamlining trial activities and including using technology to reduce the burdens for conducting enrolling participants into clinical trials, again, creating a better foundation for doing clinical research. He writes, quote, "Innovative methods and technologies offer the opportunity to develop the evidence to meet FDA's rigorous standards more efficiently and to answer questions that might not be possible using traditional methods." And these include things like the conduct of clinical trials. Among his proposals would be to eliminate unnecessary burdens to data formatting. I mean, this stuff, it sounds technical, but if you can build better systems for collecting data, for enrolling people in clinical trials, the process itself can become far more seamless. And I think these are aspects of where regulation meets the practical world of clinical trial enrollment, where historically there hasn't been as much focus, because in some respects, it requires pulling together stakeholders beyond just FDA. FDA can't regulate all these aspects. They can put out guidance, they can make recommendations, but it really requires multiple stakeholders to come together to try to change the processes for how we do some of these things. He also talks about leveraging the data that are already being created in our health system, which can reduce unnecessary costs and burdens to patients and broader and the broader healthcare system. China's biggest advantage, again, is their low cost of labor, and that's why they've been able to put lots of researchers against these problems and be fast followers to our molecules or develop me-too better molecules. But our advantage is going to be our ability to use technology. And this was a point Lowell made in our conversations more recently. Our ability to deploy artificial intelligence to accelerate drug discovery, machine learning, to refine clinical trial design, computational platforms to predict safety and efficacy long before patients enrolled in clinical trials. Really, the technology that's becoming a more important component of drug discovery and development, and I think it's going to accelerate in its impact. Those are places where we can gain a competitive edge and offset some of the low labor costs that China enjoys, that gives them an advantage over our discovery process. And a lot of these tools, when you think about them, particularly use of AI, I know it's a buzzword. Everyone has to have their, component of AI in every speech they give, but this is really moving from the margins to the mainstream. We're seeing it on the drug discovery side. We're seeing it impact discovery. In the venture world, we recently founded a company, Zera Therapeutics, with Mark Tessier-Levine from, Stanford. I know this Northern California, Southern California. We licensed the technology from David Baker's lab. He subsequently won the Nobel Prize 6 months later. So it's always good to do the licensing deal before they win the Nobel Prize. The cost of capital is much lower. But we're seeing really exciting things preclinically in terms of what we're able to do with the models that we're iterating. So I think this is real in terms of the ability to use these tools to do things that weren't possible experimentally. I just want to add two additional thoughts of my own to Lowell's report. I think the FDA has done a very admirable job building in policies to expedite or provide a higher level of touch for important products that are going to have an important public health impact based on the agency's perception, to provide more real-time guidance, to provide a little bit more hand-holding, if you will. The real-time oncology review is one example of that, where the agency really leans forward and works more closely with manufacturers on the review process and on the design of clinical trials. I think thinking about how to take those constructs and move them even earlier, where the agency may think about trying to nominate the 20 most promising discovery compounds, so things that may be preclinical or heading into phase 1, and start providing that level of early feedback much earlier in the process, in the discovery process, I think could be another way to try to advance new platforms, totally new approaches to clinical care. Because where I see a lot of products getting hung up isn't necessarily in the late stage trials, it's in the early stage. It's in going from preclinical to clinical. It's in being able to do phase 0 studies, do microdosing studies to get that early feedback. And again, I think that's where a lot of developers ex-US have a competitive edge, particularly in China. And in some respects, we have to be honest, their competitive edge comes from virtue of the fact that they don't have the same patient controls in place, and they're able to put products in patients much sooner, with less oversight than we would tolerate in the US. And so there's good reason why we have the regulation policies that we do, but there may also be ways to maintain that safety, that level of safety, while trying to lean forward. And the next is just on preclinical reform. Again, dealing with that challenge of getting products into phase 1 clinical trials more quickly. So, I'll just close. We shouldn't be putting up barriers, in my view, to the flow of IP across international borders. Beyond just creating a international arms race, if you will, international fight over IP, and will suddenly be tariffing the flow of intellectual property. The competition from other countries and the ability to license promising molecules and develop them here is important. They provide a lot of public health value. There's no question some of the molecules coming out of China are really important for public health here in the United States. You think about the CAR T product that came from Legend, that's now a Johnson & Johnson product that had stupendous results recently in multiple myeloma. These are really important products. We don't want to deny Americans access to them. But it is a threat to the biotech ecosystem here in the US if we're not matching developers around the world with the same kind of flexible policy arrangements that they're taking advantage of in terms of being able to iterate, or particularly early development. And I think that there's a lot of good ideas in this report. I hope people read it on how we can create a more robust foundation to do these things in the United States. Thanks a lot.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny Acha. I'm at Merck, and I thought that was I'm so glad to hear you say that about how we have to compete. Because I think there's a tendency sometimes to think about China as how do you keep China out rather than understand, just as you very rightly have in this excellent report, competition for products, you need competition for science and research. But I think there's some concerns in the congressional halls that there is just too much to lose at stake. So how do you advise the White House or Congress from your perspective, based on what, that excellent comment that we need to provide that excellent flexibility for early starts? How would you advise Congress to move forward? What would you ask them to do next besides the work around FDA? What else is needed?
Yeah, look, I was recently up on Capitol Hill talking about this very topic, and in all candor, my proposals really focused around the regulatory process, trying to, particularly, I think it's become difficult to move from preclinical into phase 1 here in the U.S. I think that the toxicology review process has become a little bit disconnected from the clinical review process inside the agency. And I think that this is an area that we can bring a lot of focus to. You're right. And I think what's underlying your question is this is moving. So if I'm going to interpret what you said, you're saying this is moving so fast. By the time you implement these reforms, they'll have taken over the biotech industry. We'll be licensing 50% of our compounds from China. So how do we put in place some mechanism to slow down that activity now and give ourselves time to implement a more robust policy framework in the US that can allow us to be more competitive? I think that's what you said. Yeah. All right. Fair enough. So I'm just channeling your question. Look, I think I worry. I think about that too, and I worry a lot about that because we're at a tipping point, or we might be at a tipping point in terms of just the flow of particularly venture capital and licensing deals. So I still am very reluctant to think about what some venture capital firms have been advocating, and others beyond that, which is to put in place restrictions on the flow of IP. Because I think once you open that door, there's a lot of long-term consequences to that could be very adverse to us. Because we sell IP too. We license IP. People license compounds to the U.S. for development in the U.S. and then they retain ex-U.S. rights. A lot of the Chinese companies now, I think, are moving more upstream and looking to develop products for other markets, and then they'll license away the U.S. rights. So I think once we start to put in place restrictions, we forestall all those opportunities very quickly. I will say one final point on this. I will say what happened. The evolution of this was back in sort of the 2007 timeframe, or even 2017 when I came back to FDA. A lot of what was going on was Chinese companies were trying to license late stage assets to the U.S. And there was some celebrated cases where FDA rejected those products based in part on a view that some of the clinical trial work being done in China wasn't reliable. And that's where you saw the Chinese biotech companies shift to licensing early stage compounds. I think what you're seeing now is the Chinese biotech companies becoming more sophisticated. They're able to raise capital in China. They have a robust market for biotech IPOs in the Hong Kong exchange right now. So they're raising a lot of capital. They don't need our money as much. And what they're doing is they're licensing compounds just for the US. So they're licensing away the US rights because they know they can't run the trials here, but then they're retaining ex-US rights.
Right. Okay. Any other questions in the audience here in person? All right. Oh, all right. We have a question from the, what do we call it? The internet?
Who's the dinosaur now?
Yeah, exactly. We are at global war in everything we eat, wear, drugs, and IP. We have been generous in sharing IP due to the perceived cost. Why don't we take a relook and change strategies? So maybe rephrase it. You suggest not getting into an IP war, but in terms of figuring out how to manage that in the balance between US IP and, let's say, Chinese IP, do you see any upside or downside to taking that approach?
To getting in a global IP war?
Yeah.
I mean, look, we may end up here because of the pace of the impact on sort of US biotech ecosystems and the pace of the deal making. Although I think that you can make an argument that the pace of the deal making is going to start to slow, or maybe we'll reach a temporary plateau, which will give us time to catch up. I just worry about the fact that we are very dependent in the US on being able to sell our IP to other markets. Sure, people are licensing compounds from China, but people are licensing a whole lot of US IP. And so once we go down the road of creating a precedent for trade barriers to intellectual property and not just steel and aluminum, I don't know where that ends. I mean, I'm not a political scientist who can forecast those things, but it seems like you're cracking open a door that could be very adverse to an IP-based industry that's dependent upon selling its own intellectual property into other markets.
Great. Okay.
Hi, Janet Woodcock, private citizen. I would like to say that I think, when you make these discussions, that the first in human issue is severable from the China issue, okay? Because people are going to Australia, they're going to the UK, they're going to Europe, okay, and so forth. And so if you start confounding these two issues and you get yourself in a muddle, I think the first in human issue is very difficult and it's very technical. And the problem is because it involves human safety, right? And what your bar is for human safety, at least purportedly, involves that. And it will be invoked in any attempt to hasten or remove barriers, right? And you alluded to that, Scott. Yeah. So, but that's severable from the issue of one of the things China's doing, you didn't mention, is they have an industrial policy around this, and they've been pumping money into their industry and their universities, right? And that's why they're so ascendant. So I just think, but discussing the first in human issue and the barriers to getting into humans, that's a very discrete and very technical issue. And I actually agree with the people who are complaining about it, as most people know. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying you ought to really think about what you're talking about. Okay, it's not about China. It's about what is required for first in human safety and what is the best method to do that. And how would you change it? How would you analyze it in order to change it? You can't change it by saying, oh, they can do this better in other countries. That won't make it change. So.
I think many of you now understand what my mornings started like when I was at FDA. It's a point. It's a point well taken. Janet has taught me an enormous amount. My point is, so oftentimes in policymaking, things don't line up elegantly, but you can use one challenge to try to drive reform with another challenge. And I think you need to look for those opportunities. And Janet was always a master of doing that. I learned it from her, trying to advance policies in the sort of framework in which you're able to do it. But I do think, looking at it from the investment standpoint, what I see happening is that the Chinese biotech companies are able to iterate their molecules much more quickly because they're able to do microdosing studies. But they also put things into phase 1 studies that they shouldn't. And I'm not saying we should be doing that here, but we need to acknowledge that reality is that they'll develop a sort of suite of similar molecules, and they'll put them all into patients and get data back and then take the most promising one forward because they're able to see evidence against biologic target. We never would allow that here. But I think we could be, we could do better. Like, we can use data sets to stratify the level of preclinical requirements we impose on a molecule based on how novel it is. I think there's ways we can modernize it. And it's not going to solve, you're right, it's not going to solve the China problem. But I think it would help start to make this platform more competitive. And that's really what I think a lot of what Lowell's report is about, is how to make the overall foundation of the clinical development discovery process here in the US much more efficient.
Right.
And, well, anyway, I'll stop there.
All right. Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Gottlieb. Let's give him another hand. All right, so we're going to go to more of a discussion about the white paper. I'm going to have a few of our expert guests join me up here on the stage. Annie, Ken, and Janet, if you can grab a seat. All right, so I know Dana did a quick introduction of our panelists, but I'm going to help set the stage with a little bit more background. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel here. The purpose of this is really kind of to react and reflect on what's been presented today, not just what Lowell presented and what you all have read, I'm sure, have read the entire white paper, but also on what Dr. Gottlieb just mentioned. We did have a couple of additional comments and questions that came in over Zoom, so we will try to weave those into this conversation as we head into this Q&A session. First of all, I'd like to introduce someone who really doesn't need any introduction, Dr. Janet Woodcock. She brings unparalleled FDA experience as the former longtime director of CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, from 1994 to 2004, and from 2007 to 2021, where she oversaw the modernization of drug approval processes and introduced risk management approaches to drug safety. She also served as acting FDA commissioner from 2021 to 2022, bringing the regulatory agency perspective to our discussion. Dr. Ken Drazan is chairman, CEO, and co-founder of ArsenalBio, bringing the industry voice as a serial entrepreneur who has founded and led multiple healthcare companies, including Verb Surgical, which was acquired by J&J, served as president and chief business officer of Grail, and as Dana mentioned earlier, a member of the USC Schaeffer Center Advisory Board. As a board-certified liver transplant surgeon with faculty appointments at Stanford and UCLA, which will not hold against him, he bridges clinical medicine and business innovation. And then last but not least, most importantly, really the voice of the patient. Annie Kennedy serves as Chief of Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Engagement at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, representing the patient advocate perspective after nearly 3 decades in rare disease advocacy. She's led landmark studies on the economic burden of rare disease and helped develop community-driven guidance for patient involvement in therapy development, giving voice to the 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open up this panel for a free-for-all question. Since we sent you a bootleg copy of the white paper in advance, since you all had an opportunity to digest it completely, I'm going to start with Ken. What was the one recommendation that you found most interesting, relevant, maybe if you want to push back on it, or something you think we should prioritize? Ken?
Thank you very much.
Grab the microphone if you could.
Thank you, Barry. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I thank you, Lowell, and your colleague who put this beautiful lattice of opportunities for us to discuss. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here in this masterclass between Scott and Janet for the moments that we had them up there. We even got an insight into his morning staff meeting, which is rarefied air for all of us. But seriously, this is really important work that we're talking about here. It's an important industry which often is thought about as a coastal industry for the most part, that a lot of this innovation is happening on one coast and another. But the reality is that work flows all across the country. And so I hope that we can all recognize that this is a national issue that we're trying to address here and optimize. So, with respect to the maybe the one topic that I like to talk about, it's I'd like to continue to channel what Scott has brought up here, which I wasn't anticipating to be a major part of his conversation, but which is what really affects the work that I do, which is at the top of the funnel, we have innovation that's happening in universities and institutes, and that flows into new company formation, job creation, intellectual property creation, and venture capital formation. And that's a critical growth sector for our industry. So we really have to take a look at how the work that Lowell has outlined here will affect that funnel and reduce friction and, in fact, accelerate. And so the opportunity that I'd like to address is the acceleration process. And while the document really focused for the large part in the later activities, I'd like to make sure everybody leaves here thinking about what we can do in the top of the funnel, which is what Scott and Janet were addressing. And there are so many components in this funnel, that one can address individually, but will reduce friction all the way through the funnel, which is, for example, simplification of document submission. We're talking about a typical IND, a 5,000-page document. There's a whole cottage industry of creating friction in that process. But to the extent we can figure out how to simplify that process so that submissions can be delivered with less focus on format and more focus on content, would be a huge advantage, and millions of dollars are spent, by companies in preparation for that, which is a topic that's in the document, but I would put a pin in it. The second, which is really important here, as pointed out, is there's a lot of inconsistency on how to handle toxicology with new products. I'm currently working in the cell therapy field, and with really advanced gene editing approaches for these human cells. Our own company now is in its third IND submission in this area, so we've streamlined what that looks like, but still the uncertainty of how the regulator will perceive a complex edited product is an area of opportunity for us, because we'll only head towards more complexity, not less. The third area that I would like to point out as it relates to this is communication. Type B meetings are difficult to get with the FDA. And for those unfamiliar, these are early meetings before the IND is filed, like an interact meeting or a pre-IND meeting. And those meetings are increasingly rarefied air for companies. If there is an opportunity for that process to be expanded, it will reduce the uncertainty for truly innovative products. I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Barry.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. All right. Well, Dr. Woodcock, do you have any thoughts on either anything that, I'm sure you have thoughts, anything that Scott said, anything that was in the paper, or anything you want to react to what Ken said?
Well,
oh, sorry. Use the microphone.
part of the problem is, okay, if the is simply the time available to the staff to do all this. I've always thought they should work most of their time. It's like Kevin knows, Keith knows, people in the audience who work on having a strong policy framework so they can apply it, right? But they spend most of their time in documentation, which maybe AI is going to help with, okay? But I think right now, when they have lost their administrative support staff and are having to do timekeeping themselves, they're not going to look that kindly to a Type B meeting. So I think you have to analyze what staffing model you're going to do. I'm very practical. I mean, it's just like, how do you actually do this? Not theory, but how do you actually get it done, right? And what is the staffing model? Everybody in industry is crying for more early input, okay, and especially with innovation, something that isn't just me too, you know, what we're doing. So that was my, I mean, all these recommendations will require executive leadership that's focused on execution. not policy necessarily, but execution of the policy. And if you don't have that, then it ain't going to happen. So I think you always need an addendum, Lowell, that says, and we need people who actually can get this done, right? So that my second reaction to the report is it doesn't go far enough. I think the topics are really good. I think actually, although what's happening in my mind is very unfortunate what has happened to the agency, okay? However, it may provide an opportunity by sort of blowing up so much, okay? Because there were ossified practices that Kevin and I were unable to change. We attempted the modernization of the new drug review process. And then both Kevin Bugan and I went to Operation Warp Speed and were called away from that. It was what we had to do, but it left it unfinished and it has backslidden, if that's a verb, since. And I don't think there remain people in that shop other than Rick Pastor who are really focused on innovation. I think right now they're focused on circling the wagons. So to be specific, if I have a few more seconds, okay.
Please.
Okay, I think the current drug development process as is envisioned was for organic molecules for large populations. Okay, it is not a fit for the new technologies. They need a completely different. And I think we need to have process approval. Okay, go back to the beginning. Somebody is saying, the process is the product or whatever. Okay, I think we need to, and for rare diseases, and also we need just a very different development pathway. People have to get over it. The RCT is not the right tool for these small populations, for example. And instead of like trying to force a square peg into a round hole, we need to think, what is the best way to evaluate cellular therapies? What is the best way to evaluate this rare disease intervention? Okay, how can we figure out, does it work? And if it's safe enough given the circumstances? So, but I just don't see that kind of thinking right now coming out of the agency because of there are people who are embattled. However, I'm thinking about it and I have all kind of ideas about what needs to change. But I think Kevin's laughing over there. You guys have been the victims of this too. I think that we need radical change in the process and that we need to rethink how we do things. The report has good categories there, but I just don't think it goes far enough. And I think it's probably important to talk Congress into this so that they understand. And Annie, I know you've been working on this, and so is the whole rare disease community. I've been working with them, but I think it's broader than that. I think, for example, Scott, I think part of the future is going to be actually individualized medicine will go to large diseases too. Okay, but we got to start somewhere, and you can't approve a product for one person, right? You can't even filing an IND for one person is an incredible waste of time, right? So how do we change our way of thinking about developing these type of individualized therapies so that we use like a platform or process approach rather than the individual molecule has to be regulated. But this causes so much cognitive dissonance in so many people that it's going to be very hard. But that type of thing, that's going to be the future of product development.
And if I may say, pardon me, I'm going to grab just 60 seconds. This approach towards these new innovative modalities, RNAi, messenger RNA, cell therapy, vectorology approaches, this is where the U.S. really does stand out. We're there first. The next iteration is still coming from here. And that could be an area where the U.S. can really continue to lead as compared to others where our challenges are going to be overcome by the low cost of labor and federal support that we see in China as compared to here.
Interesting. Yeah, because don't forget, these new therapies, a lot of them address the root cause of the problem. And often the root cause, if it's genetic, it's going to be highly variable amongst people. Therefore, but what we don't maybe need to do is randomize. If you have a large enough treatment effect, you don't need statisticians. They get very hurt by when I say this. But really, people were able to conclude that penicillin treated pneumococcal pneumonia because their patients picked up their bed and walked out. Okay. So I think we need to rethink how we do the evaluation, remove the sort of semi-religious attitude toward the RCT and think it's just a tool, okay? And there may be better tools in various circumstances. And phase 1, 2, and 3, we made that up, okay? We don't need to do it that way. So I'll stop. Poor Scott, he's probably like, oh, I need to leave.
All right, thanks. That's awesome. Well, okay, this is I don't know about you all, but a lot of this stuff is like way over my head. Like no, it's okay. I mean, like it's all about the product development side of it, the science of it, the supply chain, the mechanics of getting stuff to market. But we're really in this for the people at the end of the product. And so, Annie, what are your thoughts from a patient perspective? Or if you want to talk about the product development side of it, that's great too. But maybe bring a sense of like reality into the conversation for us.
I mean, this is fascinating. I mean, this is incredibly important. I guess when I read the report, I see the world through rare disease colored glasses. So I'm going to cheat and say that all sections are important, but I think it scaffolds through what's important to rare disease innovation. So when I read the report, I would have reorganized and said rare disease innovation first, and then everything scaffolds under that. So how do we protect and enhance the accelerated approval pathway? How do we use real world evidence? How do we ensure we have manufacturing? So I think it's an incredibly important report, and I think it all applies to rare disease innovation. I appreciate that reports take a long time to produce, and so I'm really grateful that this report came out, and I think it has a lot of application to our rare disease community's work. I do also appreciate that we're living in a very dynamic environment. And so when we think about how do we think about implementation, as Janet's talking about within this current context, we've been doing a lot of tracking of what's happening right now within the agency. So we think a lot about within the capacity of those who are working within the agency, what do we do with this information? What do we do with these recommendations? We're looking at, we have some folks who've been tracking even within recent months. What are the decisions that are coming out of the agency? What do those look like? And we see our communities being significantly impacted by decisions. So we worry about the opportunities to provide some additional infrastructure, some additional support to reviewers. I have some back of the envelope stats that out of the decisions that have come out of the agency, out of products that have been granted accelerated approval in rare disease, we've seen in rare cancer, 67% have had approvals, but in non-oncologic rare, 0% have had accelerated approvals. So in our mind, that calls for more opportunity to really double down on the use of the accelerated approval pathway, double down on the understanding of the need for that pathway in rare disease. In delays and denials in progressive rare neurodegenerative pediatric diseases, 86%. So again, need for supports and wraparound and implementation of what these recommendations are in review divisions across the agency. So we're really trying to understand where we can be taking some of the findings of this report and work that others are doing to ensure that what's in the pipeline right now ensures success for our communities who don't have time to wait for us to reimagine and re-envision a regulatory environment, because we know that all of these denials and delays weren't necessarily deserving of those denials and delays. And we have patients who can't afford to wait for all new studies to start over again. So that's when I look at this report, I see a lot of opportunity to lean in to enhance what's happening now.
Please.
I agree what I've been telling people because the agency's been so flattened and their policy staff demolished and so forth. What I've been telling people is come together and lead from the outside. Okay, if you want data standards, FDA doesn't have to make them. You can pick up FHIR, you can pick up, HL7, you can do different, you can create things on the outside. I think that people are very used to agency leading, but there's no statutory construct that says, FDA has to come up with all these ideas and people can develop guidance on externally. And that's what I have been advising, because I think this is a time when we're not going to see a lot of technical output from the agency other than the actual review mechanics in the different centers.
Ken?
Yeah, I just wanted to also put some context into the rare disease urgency and how that affects the larger population needs for medicines. It's often through rare disease that we understand mechanistically how to solve a really complex problem. And so what's often called the long tail of small populations can really impact the speed at which we solve the really big problems across the population. That's how we've found our way with cardiovascular medicine, looking at some of the rare diseases there that can allow us the opportunity. And so from a regulatory framework, if we can make the types of changes being articulated in the document and also through the professionals that have witnessed this bottleneck, the opportunity to impact the world more broadly is a U.S. opportunity. We don't see rare disease medicines being developed in China, but we do see it happening here first. And so that's another opportunity for us to continue to lead.
Yeah, I see the very fatal rare disease, especially the pediatrics, as the point of the spear. Because if there are therapies that can help these children live and thrive, who's going to object to that? I mean, and so if we do different processes and we pilot those processes there, say for individualized medicine, then it can gradually then broaden behind that point of the spear. So I do think that's where we ought to start. The technologies are available right now. It's simply there is no pathway to market at the moment.
And I think you both just answered one of the questions that was posted on Zoom. It's a long question, so I'm going to maybe add a little bit more context. Can you help, for those of us who are not as familiar with the rare disease world, can you give some examples of how it is that innovation in rare disease has helped then broaden to the general population? Because there is a little bit of a context of like, okay, no disrespect to people who are suffering from rare disease, and actually you put them all together, there's a lot of them, but there's also a lot of people out there that we can tackle the big problems first. Maybe that makes more sense from a societal perspective.
Well, before they answer that, you just said if you put them all together, there are a lot of them, but there are 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. That's 10% of the US population. So now you can answer the question. But when people think rare, they think, oh, well, maybe there's 1 in a million. No. 30% of the US population is living with rare diseases, more than 50% of whom are children. And of those, most of whom won't live to see their 8th birthday. So the urgency in rare is significant. We have fewer than 5% of those have approved therapies, and we do not have cures. So I need to put a pin in that urgency, but now you talk about the benefit to others.
Well, I can give you a personal experience. When I was a practicing transplant surgeon, we would split the mother's liver into a small piece and transplant that into the child that had an end-stage liver disease. That birthed the opportunity to split an adult organ into 2 and then deliver it into an adult with liver disease. So we learned from pediatric and rare diseases how to solve bigger problems. The same is true with solving genetic disorders and the utility of whole genome sequencing that allows us to make these diagnoses earlier. And now we're seeing the benefits of that in oncology, ultimately immunology, metabolic disease, and so forth. So this is an opportunity for the U.S. to be a stalwart leader. But if we have a regulatory framework that can pull these opportunities in, then that really makes us special.
Yeah. And I would say, to answer the question, a lot of people with common diseases have a rare disease if you look at under the hood. Okay. Because it used to be anybody who had swelling had dropsy. Okay. Whether they had heart failure, liver failure, whether they had too much salt, whatever, venous insufficiency, they all had dropsy. Okay. And now, okay, we say you have heart failure, but under the hood, you may have genetically based heart failure. Okay. And all of a sudden, then you look at that and what gene is mutated, and it might be the same gene, but different mutations in different people. If you want to get to the root cause, you have to affect that gene. Okay, then we're starting to talk about individualized therapy. But we can't start there because that's too complicated, right? But we can start with children with genetic fatal diseases where it's very clear. The other thing I want to say about this is because these are such powerful interventions, because they address the root cause, and they may, reverse it, or in things like cell or gene therapy may cure it. That's one of the reasons we can have a different development program than with small molecules, where maybe they help 40% of the people in the trial, okay, but 20% in the placebo were helped. So only 20% of the people were actually benefited from this intervention. That's pretty standard. Okay. So these interventions, are very, very powerful. So that they merit a different approach to their evaluation. So, but that's why rare diseases aren't what we think they are, because a lot of common diseases are rare too.
Okay, that helps. All right. So for those who turned out again in blistering cold weather to be here in person, please think of some questions, because I've got this device here that's feeding me all these questions from those who are on Zoom, sitting in their cozy chairs, watching this on their computer. And I think, you made the effort to turn out. You should have the opportunity to ask some questions. So please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. But in the meantime, I do have some questions. The last one is actually for Annie. What should rare disease drugs have to show for approval? When you say some of these drugs didn't deserve rejections, what standards should I meet? When are CRLs acceptable in this context of urgency? CRL is
a complete response letter.
All right, thank you.
So, okay, so I want to be clear, and that's probably a better question for Janet. I'm not in a position to adjudicate regulatory decisions. What I am in a position to do is look at trends and look at what's happening. But I will say that the rare disease community doesn't want lower regulatory standards. We want products that are safe and efficacious. What we have right now is a regulatory pathway called the accelerated approval pathway that enables a product to be approved based on a surrogate biomarker. Sometimes FDA meets with the regulator or with a sponsor. Oftentimes there's a patient community involved in those discussions to understand the context of that clinical development program. And it is deemed appropriate to move a pipeline forward based on the accelerated approval pathway, because that biomarker is a better way to detect whether or not there is a change in that condition during the term of a clinical trial. In some cases, that is going to be a better, more effective measure on the underlying pathophysiology of a disease. If that product is approved based on that surrogate at the time of approval, it is based on the prediction that that will be reasonably likely to correlate with a clinical benefit. And then there is a requirement that that company show that clinical correlation after that approval time period. It is not a lower regulatory standard. It just demonstrates that there is a correlation between that biomarker and then clinical efficacy later, clinical function later. That has saved the lives of hundreds, now thousands of people with rare diseases. That is what we talk about when we talk about the accelerated approval pathway. It has also saved the lives of hundreds and thousands, probably tens of thousands of people with HIV, with cancer, but it's come under scrutiny because it is thought to be a lower rigor and a lower standard, and it is not. Make no mistake, it is not. It's actually sometimes harder to get something approved because of that rigor. I'm going to take a pause because I saw Janet pick up the microphone, but I will say that not all products that are approved in rare go through the accelerated approval pathway. But the biggest problem is that once something is approved via the accelerated approval pathway, in rare disease, we now have to re-adjudicate that in the access environment. So now when we have approvals in accelerated approval, we now have payers that are requiring that we again have to go through decision-making time and time again to get access to those products. So now different standards have been applied in the access environment so that this environment that was created, this regulatory pathway that was created in order to be able to get to answers sooner, understanding that there was an unmet need and a need to be able to get drugs to patients as quickly as possible, is now being defeated because now we have additional hoops and hurdles to jump through in the access environment. And we're creating inequity in the access environment. So patients are now having irreversible disease progression and often dying before they can get the products because of the additional hurdles we're adding in the access environment. But what I was citing with these stats was that we're not even now seeing those products be approved in the regulatory environment. And that's what we're worried about.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say, sort of expand on this a little bit, because despite what, and I agree with what Annie said, the probably tens of thousands of lives have been saved or extended. I've published some analysis on this in Cancer, by early availability of ultimately effective life-extending treatments. Despite that, despite, for example, that the cancer survival has increased in the United States over the last decade and a half, more or less attributed to the therapeutics that have been approved. Despite all this, accelerated approval has gotten, a lot of opponents. And it's mainly, I think, because of cost. Because people don't want to pay for these, right? If they were really cheap, then people wouldn't care that we had accelerated approval. But the second thing is that, as this was mentioned, is that the confirmatory trial is what they call that trial. It shows the link. Confirmatory trials are often hard to complete, especially in the rare disease space. Why is that? If you had a rare disease and somebody the FDA approved a life-altering therapy, would you go on a placebo group to prove that it was life-altering for the other people in the other arm? Probably not. Especially if it was your child. Would you put your child in a trial and they would have a 50% chance of getting a placebo, with a very serious disease, because this is only for serious diseases. So it got a bad name because it was hard to complete these trials, all right? And that's why that gets the thing. RCTs, and they were told to do RCTs, and RCTs are the wrong tool to evaluate these therapies. And so some of these trials failed predictably because there's a bias toward what they call the null hypothesis, when you can only randomize like a few people in each arm. And then everybody said, accelerated approval is wrong and, and all this kind of stuff. So it's very unfortunate because this has been a marvelous tool to get therapies that are highly likely to have clinical benefit to people who really need them.
So just to counter that is what we often hear, is that there are a number of things we hear. There's a tsunami of accelerated approval products, that it's scorching the earth in the access environment. So the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, we've done a number of studies to really look at that and really analyze that. The other thing is when we looked through Fedora and looked at opportunities to protect and enhance the accelerated approval pathway, one of the things that's difficult is that we didn't have a lot of data to understand how the accelerated approval pathway was being utilized in rare or non-oncologic, non-infectious disease rare versus how it was being utilized in the oncologic space and in the infectious disease space. So we undertook doing some of those analyses, and we worked with G.K. Raju out of MIT, who actually Janet had recommended we use because he had done a lot of the oncology studies. And then we also did a series of studies looking at the access environment. We worked with Tufts Newdigs for those, and we also worked with Ken Thorpe. So just a little bit of data, because it's really important that we understand this. So to tease apart how the accelerated approval pathway, and we published all of this, so you can go look at all these publications, but just some high-level data so you can understand. So we can understand what's actually happening in accelerated approval. 58% of accelerated approvals have converted within 5 years. So that's a really important stat. The time to conversion, though, is different in rare versus oncology versus HIV. So there's nuance in this, which also speaks to the complexity of the trial design and the complexity of these patient communities. That's incredibly important. By the end of 2022, 98% of the first 105 approved accelerated approvals that were approved in 2010 or earlier had either been converted or withdrawn. The accelerated approval pathway works as intended. So when we think about the recommendations in this paper, bringing it back to this paper, there are so many opportunities to do new things, but we do not need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The infrastructure that we have is working as intended. Now, looking ahead to the access environment, in rare disease, we have a more than 50% Medicaid eligible patient community. So we look at Medicaid. Medicaid is incredibly important. We did a study with Ken Thorpe, and Ken Thorpe had previously done a study in 2021 looking at the Medicaid environment and the overall drug spend. And what he found was that accelerated approval drugs were 1% of the Medicaid drug spend. Well, the pushback we got from payers was, well, that's not rare diseases. So we did a study looking at rare disease. And what we found was that in 2017, the accelerated approval Medicaid drug spend in rare disease was 0.67%. And in 2022, and there had been some landmark approvals in rare disease in that time, it was 0.84%. There had not been a dramatic shift. There was not a tsunami of therapies. And then we did a pipeline analysis modeling. We did a prospective look, looking at cell and gene therapies combined with drug therapies. And what we saw was there was not going to be a tsunami of therapies. We anticipated there'd be 45 new approved products through 2033, representing that there would be about 26,000 rare disease patients who would be served by these therapies. And it would represent about 0.1% of the burden of disease in rare disease. So again, we need to invest in rare disease therapeutic development. And the infrastructure we have in place is working. We have to ensure that what is in today's pipelines is accelerated.
I think we need to invest in educating the media and the opponents of this about the actual facts, such as you mentioned. Although, I know people who work in the insurance business, and now they know about that one pediatric patient they're covering who's costing $300,000 a year or something like that. But I tell them, well, if this person wasn't treated, they'd probably be, pulling down many more charges. And I know you did a cost effectiveness study, and that's very helpful. But I don't think, there has been an overt effort, well organized and funded, to discredit accelerated approval. And we hear that all the time. And when you look at the facts, you look at cancer, you look at HIV, you look at the impact on these diseases, and then the rare diseases, you think, where is this? And so, they pull up one problem and, this one didn't work or something like that. Well, that's the design of the program, is to take a little bit more chances. If every single one worked, we might as well have just approved them all, right? With the regular approval, right? Because there's absolutely no additional risk taken. But So, but I think the program is really being stifled by this external pressure. And I think some of what you're seeing, that's what you're seeing in the congressional action and everything. Oh, there's some terrible problem. Much of it, like I think, was the intractability, some of the staff at the FDA to refuse to approve like Fabrazyme for all those years. Things like that, right? Okay, because you had to have an RCT, even though it's standard of care and everybody's needed an RCT. So I do think it's a complicated problem, but I do think there has to be some more organized pushback against this effort.
Right. Ken, real quick, and then I think Jenny, did you have a question? Yeah. Or no? All right, Jenny.
I'll make a comment, but please, Jenny, go ahead.
Well, I was going to pivot. So if you wanted to follow up on the rares,
pivot
go for it.
too.
Oh, you are? Oh,
Let's
I'll pivot.
Pivoting.
then I'll pivot.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. So again, it's the report picks up really beautifully on the need to get an address on uncertainty and how we're going to manage it. And I was going to get greedy and say, well, we need 2 more reports. And Annie already brought up the first one, which is how do you align with uncertainty with payers and downstream decision makers, because they don't see uncertainty in the same way. And that's one of the reasons why it's not moving smoothly through. So I will take my second chapter, or the third book that I want you to write, which is how do you deal with the uncertainty internationally? So as an innovator, I am obviously focused on how I deal with an uncertainty here in the United States and with the FDA, but I have to develop my products for patients around the world. And I'm going to steal a phrase that other people have used and put it in this context, that when the FDA sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. I have seen that writ large right now. So I would also be interested to know, how can we take the recommendations that this, really well thought out recommendations you have here, and think also about that international dimension, which again seems to have gone a little bit on the back burner. But when you're dealing with core critical, and particularly if you're a small company, you need the world to be aligned. And so be really grateful to hear the panel's views on that.
Yeah, and before one of you guys respond, I'll do a quick pitch for other work that we do at USC Schaeffer. We spend a lot of time on the value side of the house, and we've done some work in health technology assessment and how you can properly use, if done well, health technology assessment can really provide much more certainty for drug developers much earlier in the process. And what I found fascinating as I got more and more involved in the health technology assessment community is how much absolute awe and reverence the global community has for FDA and FDA standards. We are so lucky to have such an amazing asset here in such a rigorous and really well-defined institution. And they will take, like it's gold, what's coming out of FDA. So if we can improve the FDA process, then that's one way to export the brilliance that we have in FDA that ultimately gets pulled into HTA processes. It's a way to subtly infiltrate their decision-making process with really well-designed studies with great data. They suck it up. They use it in their decision-making process, and that's all they've got. They've got to use that data when they're using their HTA. And so if we can give them the right kind of information, we can really influence that. And again, that's other work that really shows how a lot of the work that we do at USC Schaeffer now with the FDA approach can really tie the full lifeline of product development. But who wants to take that? Ken?
Well, I'm going to bring up another topic, but it sort of ties into what you were talking about. There are, 2 topics brought up in the document about artificial intelligence and accelerating development. But there was also an important one that was brought up here, and that's the cost of capital, the cost of actually conducting these trials. There are roughly 100 million Americans whose healthcare data is in the electronic medical record system, yet only 20% of clinical trial enrollees occur in the United States. Of course, we can't source every diseased patient, but it's a huge reservoir for us to develop real-world evidence through artificial intelligence that could incorporate these issues around lowering the cost of pivotal trials, addressing the post-approval conduct of manufacturers. And were the FDA to help accelerate this kind of opportunity that would draw in the electronic medical record syndication process beyond just interoperability, but actually drawing it into a competitiveness issue for the United States, it would be a huge resource for all developers, medical device products, as well as pharmaceutical products, that could allow us to use real world evidence to lower the cost of clinical trials, whether it's mid-stage trials, late-stage trials, post-approval trials. And I know that isn't necessarily, at the heart of the document, but it's a huge opportunity for us in the future. Just look at the data that's come out of the UK Biobank recently. For those that maybe follow Eric Topol's Ground Truth podcast and documents on Instagram. Just remarkable data about predictive intelligence that could be applied to how we develop drugs and medicines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the FDA. Okay. When I was there and objecting vociferously, okay, when the Office of the National Coordinator decided to, electronify health records, and they overtly decided to let 100 flowers bloom or whatever. And research was not of interest. I mean, because they had greater objectives, okay, is to get out a paper. However, here we are. How many years later is this? Okay. Now they are trying to think about research. But I don't think you should put this on the FDA's shoulders. It needs to come out of HHS.
Maybe they pull. They become interested party.
Now, to my point, that the external world has to lead. Laura Esserman, I work with the iSpy people, and they are doing something called OneSource, and they're running their clinical trials off of their electronic health record directly, okay, rather than having everything transferred into case reports and so forth. Now, again, the FDA gives them a hard time about that, okay, but that's the future, really, because what is the actual ground truth? It's what's in the record, maybe, if you can verify it. So I think that is something the private sector should lead on and get FDA to go along with it by demonstrating that it's robust and valid and so forth. But, again, I don't think in this climate, we should expect the FDA to be coming up with all kind of sort of extracurricular activities. So
it's not this year's project for sure. But yeah, maybe it'll be for our children.
Janet, if you can talk a little bit about, switching gears for a second, about advanced manufacturing. Any thoughts there, what FDA could or should be doing to help promote more domestic production besides tariffing people and forcing them to?
I've been working on this since 2002. All right. When we started the drug manufacturing, or what it was called, pharmaceutical manufacturing for the 21st Century Initiative. Okay. And that was very modest goals. At first, we tried to get, first of all, the FDA staff, who were being rather intractable, and then the industry to use stuff that Pringles has been using for 20 years, right? Online sensors and automation, basically. No, manufacturing, generally pharmaceutical manufacturing, despite all the efforts of the FDA, is still highly it would be recognized by chemists in the mid-19th century, much of it. It has big vats and stirring and all this kind of stuff. But more and more people are moving over to continuous. I think it is finally gaining traction. You will not be able to bring things back into this country unless you use advanced manufacturing. The traditional manufacturing is too dirty, at least for pharmaceuticals, and too much of a bad environmental footprint, too much everything. But with these incentives to bring it back then. But what I understand is, and I'm not sure, now probably as an ex-chief counsel, you know more than I do about this, but I think that you can drive a truck through the GMP regulations. Okay. And so I don't think, but they were starting until the purge of everybody who does this stuff happened. They were starting a GMP rewrite because the last GMPs are written in the 1970s or something like that, or started, right? So I don't think the regulations are the problem. I think it's habit. People in Cedar told me, we'll never accept parametric release. It's like, what? Okay, that means you do automation and you get automatically all the release specs are met and you just get it out the door. You don't take it over to the lab and have them do some wet chemistry on it. You know, almost everything now is real-time release. Yeah, in line. Yeah. And they said, we'd never accept that. And I said, forget you, right? Forget that. We're going to accept that. We're going to encourage it. And we have that now. Okay. We have that for products, but we're going to have to go much more in that direction if we want to bring things back. But no, other than like beating them up around the head and shoulders, certain of the people, maybe some of the inspectors and everything to get them with the modern program, I don't think there are actual FDA barriers. Now, can FDA encourage this or whatever? Look, I tried. I talked myself blue in the face. On Tuesday, I gave 2 lectures in a course about this Tuesday, okay? So, but you know, it requires, and I don't understand this at all, but it requires capital investment and things I don't understand, okay? And motivation to do it. And it also is going to require a workforce. And so we got the National Science Foundation to give some grants, like to Purdue and Rutgers, I think, for setting up continuous manufacturing so they could train advanced scientists who you need, okay? You can't just hire factory workers to run a computer-controlled environment, okay? So I think it's all doable. I don't think the barriers are regulatory. I don't understand them, but I think they have to do with money and stuff like that. And probably technology too. And the fact that, okay, they have this asset, they've developed this asset. They want to get it out the door and have their patent life, you know, all that. They don't want to think about how to make it in the most effective way. But, you know, I talked to, like, take Lilly and Novo Nordisk. Okay, when you stock out of a highly desired product, you're losing a lot of money. Okay, if you had advanced manufacturing, you just turn on your plant and run it 24/7 or whatever, and you can meet the market. So there are trade-offs here. And maybe I said too much about this, but that's what I think.
Always spicy. All right. Any other questions from the audience here? Go ahead, Bill. Get the microphone.
Thank you again for a wonderful panel. I really appreciate everything. Just wanted your thoughts. I mean, in this discussion, Dr. King made an amazing comment in one of his talks in I believe it was 1968 in front of a medical society in Chicago. He said, of all the forms of inequality and injustice and of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and alarming. I just want to get your reflections and thoughts on that as we wrap up this discussion. Thank you.
I mean, I'll start. I've never heard that quote before, but I love that. You know, we've spent a lot of time this year thinking about how we make sure that we're reaching out to those in rural communities in a more meaningful way. I was struck by your comments earlier about the Alzheimer's community. My mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's just a couple months ago, and my parents lived in a very rural community, so we've had to relocate them because you can't drive, you can't live there, and your community-based healthcare can't serve you. You know, we have for a very long time been working with our rare disease community who is very disadvantaged if you can't access clinical care, clinical trials, innovative medicines, but even more than that, you can have breakthrough approvals that your clinicians don't know about for years after they're approved. So I think that quote rings true in so many ways. And one of the things we're really concerned about now is what will happen now if and when, not if, the changes to Medicaid are implemented. I mentioned earlier that we have a more than 50% Medicaid eligible community, not just because of financial eligibility, but because of the waiver eligibility. And so what will happen to our communities? We're a coalition organization, so we're comprised of patient advocacy organizations. And what we've been hearing from the patient advocacy organizations we work with is that not only are they having a hard time now financially because of the change in federal funding to those organizations, but because the calls that they're getting from the patients that they serve are now less about financial funding for durable medical equipment and medicine, but are about financial funding for food and for utilities, because families now don't have the resources to pay for their basics. And so families are having to make horrible, hard choices, which then obviously now they're not able to pay for transportation. We did a panel of clinical professionals at a recent meeting, and the panel was supposed to be about gene and cell therapy and how clinicians in different diverse communities were talking about innovative medicines and the application of innovative medicines. And there were clinicians from the Bronx and LA and Toronto and different demographics. What it turned into, though, was clinicians talking about, how am I supposed to talk to patients about gene and cell therapies when, because of their education level, they don't know what DNA is? Or how do I talk to a patient about this when they live in inner city New York, and the requirements and the rules in inner city New York is that you can only have one passenger who's ambulatory on a bus with one passenger on the bus in a wheelchair, so that caregiver can't come to an appointment because she has two sons who use wheelchairs. And so we are spending a lot of time thinking about, before we even talk about clinical trials and innovative medicines, how do we just talk about basic access to care? So just your quote to me really makes us think about, we really have to rethink these models of care for our communities. So thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to try to be a little tough here, Janet. I'm going to be a little tough here. So you were head of CEDAR during a time when I believe there were some executive orders, I can't remember which administrations, that really tried to aim at improving the new drug application process. And you were at FDA when this was happening. What were the barriers? What were the challenges that you faced? Because obviously you're still calling for changes to that process. And so any suggestions on how to improve it?
I could write a book, okay, but I won't, okay? I mean, when I took over the Center for Drugs in 1994, all right, I went to all the divisions and I talked to them, and I went to the stats people, okay? And they said, we're running the adverse event reporting system. And David Kessler was out, send things to MedWatch, blah, 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 right? And I said, what is the adverse event reporting system? And they said, well, we send the report to this state and they code it. They say it's liver failure or whatever. Then we send the report to another state and they put it on microfiche. Okay. I said, okay. And then we put it in this microfiche thing, and then we have these things you put through there, and then it'll pull up all the liver failure. Okay. And then they said, but we're really behind and we have 25,000 reports, the most recent ones, in the other room in boxes. Okay. So I marched into David's office and I said, you're giving me $3 million immediately, or you're going to stop talking about MedWatch, because we're not looking at the damn things. They're in boxes. And we built this, I don't know what the first one's called, the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. Okay. And we actually developed a database. Okay. Replicate this across every single process at the Center for Drugs. They were not automated. They were not they were in paper. They were not harmonized or standardized. They were, I think I deserve like canonization. Because I took it on. Okay. We had 1,000 FOI reports that were behind. You name it. All right. Okay, it is true. I didn't make new drugs my single project. I tried to turn the organization into a functional, modern organization. That's what I did. Like we had the chemists. The chemists were each in the new drug division. So we had psychiatry chemists and we had endocrine chemists. And they might have the same product, but they would say it needs different specifications because it's an endocrine drug or a psychiatry drug. So I very unpopularly, I put them together in Office of New Drug Chemistry. They were furious, okay? And I said, you have to have the same standards, right? And et cetera, et cetera. New drugs was a very established, very hierarchical, very somewhat already ossified group of people. Very smart, did very good job. I'm just saying the critic side here. They were extremely hard to change. They had no procedures. They were doctors, can I say? They had no procedures. They had no processes. Okay. Then we had PDUFA. So we put PDUFA in, and that got us a lot of procedures and processes. In some ways, that was bad in the sense because they became so focused around PDUFA and the goals, not what people think. People think, oh, they get money, so they're going to be. No, they were very skeptical toward industry. In fact, almost at an unprofessional level sometimes, right? They were hostile toward industry. I mean, you can't be hostile. You're a professional. You're supposed to be objective, right? But they were focused around the PDUFA tasks and goals. And so all the innovation and everything. Yeah, that's right. That customer, no, the public. The public's your customer, right? No. So then with PDUFA, all that became, they developed standardization and everything, but they didn't develop innovation except where they were PDUFA goals, which often I would dream them up in other people, and then that would be imposed upon the new drugs people. And they had a lot of work to do, and they focused and they did a good job on the work. But then the documentation, I forced them to move to electronic in the late 90s. And the downside of that, we got electronic data, so they could play with the data for 1,000 years, and then they could write 300-page reports. When I took over Cedar, they were using carbon paper. They would dictate their reports, many of them, and have secretaries type them, with carbon paper. So I did try, and the second time I was at Cedar, I tried, as I said, Kevin Buchan and I organized a modernization effort of new drugs. And I did away with some of the documentation. We wanted to have a single report that was short and to the point and problem focused. We wanted to stop pretending that when somebody submitted an NDA, they didn't know anything and they were starting de novo when they'd been watching the development program, usually for 7 years or whatever, 9 years, whatever. So I tried, but it was very, very embedded. And all the criticism from the press doesn't help, because then it justifies all these positions, right? And now all the criticism from internally, as well as from the press, the people, I think, are circling the wagons. I've seen a lot of recidivism, And so, yes, I think change needs to happen. I think I did. I made a huge amount of change in new drugs, most of it invisible, though. Patient-focused drug development, they were opposed to that. Biomarker validation. Now, I had to get all those things started and implemented and done, advanced clinical trials, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I mean, I think there's something about the structure and the degree of responsibility and the unfairness of the accountability, because if they do a wonderful job, which they often do, and help people, nobody in the company thanks them, but that's about it. Yeah. But if something happens post-market, even if it's not their fault, it's like the world has come to an end and the press and blah, blah, blah. So I don't know what it is, but it is not an innovative group, and they suppress innovation. And Rick was able for a number of years, Rick Pazder in the OCE, to escape from that mold and really be innovative and so forth. So, I mean, so that's what I think.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. So we're almost at the end of our program. Leonard Schaeffer, our benefactor, would have me taken out if I didn't end this on time. So we're going to make this a really quick. I'm not going to have a wrap-up comment like we have in the agenda. We're going to let a little shout out to Keith Flanagan, who actually was the guy who helped come up with the idea behind this paper. And then he got a job and went to go work for another company. And so he recommended Lowell to head this group. So Keith, take us out.
Thanks for the shout out. And Janet, you really should write the book.
Too painful.
So at the front end, either you or Dana said USC Schaeffer is kind of newish to the FDA policy space, but you know what? It didn't look that way today. Like world-class panel, like world-class thought leadership. And as Janet and others were saying, it's more important than ever right now for you to be able to convene like the stakeholders and develop fit for purpose solutions. So like I'm doing your wrap up for you.
Better than I could have done. Thank you.
Great job.
And I swear that was not a plan. He and I did not talk about that in advance. Well, to finish this up, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. We are landing in on time. Feel free to grab a cup of coffee and hang out for a little while if you'd like to connect. Part of our mission is to try to create community. So we really want to make sure that you guys have an opportunity to get to know each other. Hopefully we can all coalesce around this white paper to try to make changes with the help of Dr. Woodcock and Dr. Gottlieb and others who know how to navigate the process. Thanks for coming.